My name's Alex. I'm 17, and I live in a town that most people just drive through on their way to somewhere else. It's the kind of place where nothing ever really happens, or so everyone says, until it does. What happened to me, what's still happening, started simple enough. It started with the woods behind my house. Every kid in our neighborhood knew those woods. We built forts in them, dared each other to go deeper than the last time, convinced ourselves we were explorers charting unknown territory. We'd sneak out at dusk, flashlights in hand, telling ghost stories that always somehow circled back to the old abandoned cabin a few miles in. Nobody had ever actually seen it, not really. It was just this legend, a whisper among us, a place of shadows and forgotten things. The cabin, they said, belonged to a family that just disappeared. One day they were there, the next, gone. No trace, no forwarding address, just an empty house slowly getting swallowed by the trees. Most of us figured it was just an old hunting shack, maybe even torn down by now. But the story stuck. It always does. My best friend Mark, he was the bravest of us, or at least he acted like it, always pushing the limits. "Come on, Alex," he'd say, "it's just a cabin. What's the worst that could happen?" We were 13 then, full of that specific brand of teenage invincibility that makes you do stupid things. So one late August afternoon, with the sun already dipping low, casting long, spooky shadows, we decided to find it. The cabin. We packed some granola bars, 2 cheap flashlights, and a sense of adventure that bordered on foolishness. The path into the woods started out clear enough, a faint deer trail we'd followed 100 times. But as we went deeper, the trees got thicker, older, the light grew dimmer, and the familiar sounds of suburban life, distant traffic, a dog barking, faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the calls of unseen birds. It felt different this time, heavier, like the air itself was pressing in on us. We must have walked for hours, or what felt like hours. My legs ached and doubt started to creep in. "Maybe we should head back, Mark," I whispered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the growing silence. Mark, ever the stubborn one, just shook his head. "We're almost there, I can feel it." He had this weird intuition sometimes, a knack for finding things. I just hoped this wasn't one of those times. Then, through a thick tangle of overgrown bushes and gnarled trees, we saw it. Not a grand haunted mansion, but a small, dilapidated shack, almost completely consumed by ivy and moss. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the windows was just a jagged hole, like an empty eye socket staring out into the twilight. A chill, not just from the cooling air, ran down my spine. It was real. The legend was real. A rusty, broken-down fence, barely visible under years of neglect, marked what must have once been the property line. The gate hung open, groaning softly in a non-existent breeze. Mark pushed it wider, and the sound was like a scream. We stepped onto what was once a yard, now just a patch of flattened, dead grass. An old, rotting well stood crookedly near the front door, its cover half missing. "Well, here it is," Mark said, his voice a little less confident than before. He tried to push open the front door, but it was stuck, swollen with damp and age. He kicked it once hard, and with a sickening splintering sound, it gave way, revealing a gaping black maw. Inside, it was even darker. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and something else. Something metallic and acrid, like old blood. Mark clicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, dancing across cobweb-draped walls and a floor covered in leaves and dirt. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light. We stepped inside cautiously, our shoes crunching on unseen debris. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms. The first was a living area, if you could call it that. A broken-down wooden table lay on its side, and what looked like the remains of a single rotting chair sat in a corner. On the wall, half covered by peeling wallpaper, was a faint, dark stain. It looked too much like an old handprint. My heart started to pound against my ribs. "Check out the other room," Mark whispered, his voice hushed now. He moved towards a doorway leading to what must have been a bedroom. I hesitated, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back into the fading light of the woods. But I was 13, and pride, that foolish, fragile thing, kept me rooted. Mark stepped into the next room, and I followed, my flashlight beam sweeping nervously around. This room was even more unsettling. A single rusted bed frame stood against the wall, its springs exposed like teeth. On the floor, scattered among the leaves and dirt, were strange, hand-drawn symbols chalked onto the floorboards. They were crude, like a child had drawn them, but they weren't childish. Circles intersecting with triangles, strange spirals, and what looked like distorted stick figures. They gave me a cold, crawling sensation on my skin. Then, Mark let out a small, sharp gasp. His flashlight was fixed on something in the corner. I moved closer, my beam joining his. It was a doll. Not a child's toy, not anymore. It was old, porcelain, with cracks running across its face like a spider web. One of its glass eyes was missing, leaving a hollow, dark socket that seemed to stare right through me. But it wasn't just the doll, it was what was around it. A small, carefully arranged circle of dried, dark petals, and in the very center, a lock of hair. Dark, coarse hair, and it was tied with a faded red ribbon. "Creepy," Mark breathed, but I could tell he was unnerved too. The air in that room felt heavy, suffocating. My eyes darted around, from the doll to the symbols to the stained walls. It felt like we weren't alone, like something was watching us from the shadows. A whisper, faint and dry, seemed to drift through the silence, or maybe it was just the wind. We didn't stay long after that. The silence in the woods as we walked back felt different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was expectant, like something was waiting just beyond our sight. We didn't talk much on the way home, both of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying what we'd seen. The cabin, the symbols, the doll, the hair. When we finally stumbled out of the woods, the first streetlights flickering on, it was like stepping back into a different world, a safe world. But something had followed us out. I could feel it. Something had been awakened. After that day, the woods felt different. They weren't just trees and trails anymore. They were watching. Mark and I tried to pretend like nothing had changed. We went to school, played video games, hung out like normal kids. But every now and then, I'd catch Mark looking out his window towards the tree line, a faraway look in his eyes. And me, I couldn't stop seeing the doll, its single empty eye staring into nothing, and those symbols on the floor. The strange things started subtly. At first, I thought I was just imagining them. A faint scratching sound coming from my window late at night, too soft to be branches. a shadow that moved in my peripheral vision, just quick enough that when I turned, there was nothing there. The air in my room would sometimes feel unnaturally cold, even with the windows closed and the heat on. My parents dismissed it as my imagination or just the old house settling. They always had an explanation for everything. I wished I did too. Then the dreams started. Vivid, terrifying dreams. I'd be back in the cabin, but it wasn't empty. There would be a girl, small and pale, with long, dark hair tied with a faded red ribbon. She wouldn't speak, just stare at me with one empty eye, the other wide and full of a profound sadness. And then she'd point, not at me, but at the corner of the room where the doll had been. Her finger, long and thin, would extend, and as I followed her gaze, the symbols on the floor would begin to glow with a faint, pulsing red light. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering, convinced I could still feel the chill of the cabin, the scent of decay. One morning, about 2 weeks after we'd been to the cabin, I woke up and found a small, withered flower petal on my pillow. It was dark, almost black, and brittle to the touch. It looked exactly like the dried petals we'd seen around the doll. My blood ran cold. My window had been shut all night. I didn't tell my parents. I just crushed it in my hand, the dry flakes feeling like ash, and threw it in the trash. Things escalated. One afternoon, I was home alone, playing games in the living room. The TV suddenly flickered, the screen going black, then coming back with static. I tried changing the channel, but it was just a hissing screen. Annoying, but not scary. Until I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the static. It sounded like a child's voice, distorted and far away. It was calling my name. Alex. I froze, the controller slipping from my numb fingers. My breath caught in my throat. The whisper grew a little louder, a little clearer. Alex, come find. The hair on my arm stood on end. I scrambled backwards, away from the TV, my eyes wide with terror. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The static cleared, and a normal show resumed, as if nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the day locked in my room, pretending to be sick. I knew I had to tell Mark everything. That evening, after school, I cornered him. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "things are happening after we went to the cabin." I told him about the dreams, the cold spots, the pedal, the voice from the TV. His face, usually so confident, slowly drained of color. He listened, his eyes wide, occasionally glancing over my shoulder as if expecting something to appear. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been hearing things too. Whispers. And I found something." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, crude and unsettling. It showed a figure, tall and thin, with long, spindly arms, standing over a much smaller figure. The smaller figure had one eye dark, like the doll, and beneath the drawing, scrawled in what looked like faded red crayon, were the same symbols we'd seen on the cabin floor. "I found it in my old fort in the woods," Mark said, his voice trembling slightly. "It was stuck under a loose board, buried pretty deep." "It wasn't there before, Alex. I know it wasn't." We were both terrified. This wasn't just imagination anymore. This was real, and it was getting closer. We started researching, spending hours online, looking for anything about the cabin, about disappearances, about strange symbols or haunted dolls. We found old newspaper clippings, snippets from town archives. The story was always the same. A family, the Millers, vanished without a trace over 70 years ago. A mother, a father, and a little girl named Eliza. The reports mentioned no bodies, no clues, just an empty house. And they mentioned rumors of strange occurrences in the woods after their disappearance, dismissed as local folklore. One night, a few days after Mark showed me the drawing, I was jolted awake by a loud thud downstairs. My heart leaped into my throat. I lay still, straining to hear. Then, a low, guttural moan coming from the living room. It wasn't human. It was something primal. I crept out of bed, my entire body rigid with fear. I grabbed the old baseball bat my dad kept by the door, my hand slick with sweat. Slowly, carefully, I descended the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing like thunder in the silent house. The living room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. And then I saw it. The television was on again, glowing with static. And standing directly in front of it, its back to me, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and distorted. Its shape seemed to shimmer, like looking through heat haze. It wasn't solid, not entirely. A deep, rattling breath filled the silence, coming from the figure. It slowly, agonizingly slowly, began to turn. I could feel my blood turning to ice. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. As it turned, I caught a glimpse of something. A dark, gaping hole where a face should have been. But just for a second, I saw something else, something deep within that void. A single, gleaming red eye. Then a sudden, blinding flash of light from the TV. The static surged, accompanied by a shriek that was both digital and eerily real, tearing through the air. I slammed my eyes shut, my hands flying up to cover my ears, the sound piercing my skull. When the ringing in my ears subsided and I dared to open my eyes, the living room was dark again. The TV was off. The figure was gone. I stood there, gasping for breath, the baseball bat still clutched in my trembling hands. My parents, miraculously, hadn't woken up. I don't know how they could have slept through that. I stumbled back to my room, threw myself onto my bed, and pulled the covers over my head, trying to make the world disappear. It's been weeks since then. The dreams haven't stopped. The strange noises haven't stopped. Sometimes I swear I can smell that metallic, acrid scent, even in broad daylight. Mark and I don't talk about it much anymore. It's too real, too terrifying to put into words. But we both know it. Whatever we woke up in that cabin, it followed us. And it's not going away. It feels like it's just waiting, watching, getting closer. Sometimes, late at night, I feel a faint pressure on my chest, like something is sitting there, just watching me breathe. And sometimes I hear a whisper, so close I could almost swear it's right next to my ear, calling my name. Alex, come home. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it wants us to find something or if it just wants us. All I know is that the woods behind my house aren't just woods anymore, and the cabin isn't just an old abandoned building. It's a doorway, and something stepped through, and it's still here.